This video is sponsored by Squarespace. More about them in just a moment. It would be better if there were nothing, since there is more pain than pleasure on earth. In the book of Ecclesiastes, the figure of King Solomon toys with a pretty strange proposition. Is it better to never have been born? Given the sufferings of life, is it all worth it? Or should we instead all regret the fact that we have come into existence? According to tradition, these thoughts were written 3,000 years ago, and yet they have found some pretty staunch defenders in the modern day. These are the anti-natalists, and they have two things to say. One, it would have been better if you had never been born. And two, you are morally obligated not to have children and subject another person to the trials and tribulations of life. Today, we are going to examine their arguments, so you can find just how much you agree with this counterintuitive idea. Our main source will be David Benatar's excellent book, Better Never to Have Been, as it is by far the most comprehensive anti-natalist philosophy I could find. But in addition, we will occasionally draw from later scholars and earlier thinkers. Get ready to learn why you should be more angry at your parents, how you vastly overestimate how good your life is, and whether we should wipe out the human race. So, let's begin by looking at the very linchpin of the antinatalist worldview, that coming into existence unacceptably harms us. But before any of that, I want to thank today's very kind sponsor, Squarespace. If you're looking to build a website, then you know it can be a real pain. First, you have to pick a domain name and then construct the thing, and then there's always the underlying fear that you're messing it up and creating something untidy and unprofessional. But this is where Squarespace comes into play. They compress all of that difficulty into a single platform and use ready-made templates to take most of the complication and pain out of website building. I've used it to design a website of my own, heavily drawing from their templates, and it's now pretty much done. Despite my own lack of technical ability, the whole process was relatively stress-free. Head to squarespace.com/unsolicited advice and use the code unsolicited advice to get 10% off your first purchase of a domain name or a website. The link's in the description if you don't want to type all that out. But anyway, back to asking, was it better to have never been born? 1. Potential harm and potential pleasure. Imagine for a moment that you are considering whether to have a child, when there is a flash of light and you see the messenger of the Roman gods, Mercury, standing before you. He lets you know that the child you would conceive that night would become uniquely hated by the queen of the gods, Juno, who will subject them to endless disasters, meaning that they will suffer for the entirety of their existence. So great is her wrath that your child would not know a moment's peace from cradle to grave. Here, intuitively, we would say it would not be in the interests of that child to be born. Non-existence would be better than existence for them. Thus, it would benefit the child to never be born, since they would never have to suffer at the hands of Juno. For them, it is better never to have been. On the other hand, let's switch the scenario. Instead of Mercury saying that your child will be uniquely cursed, he instead says they would be uniquely blessed. If the child is conceived that night, they will be granted happiness beyond imagining. They would live a blessed life and experience endless pleasures. However, you nonetheless decide that you do not want a child, and so decide not to conceive them, at least at that moment. Intuitively, this situation seems importantly different, in that it does not seem bad for this child to never be born, in the same way that it was good for the previous child to have never been born. It seems that while this potential person certainly did not benefit from never existing, they were not harmed by it either. We do not judge them missing out on their charmed life as bad for them in the same way that we considered it good for the other child to have avoided all of their suffering. This asymmetry underpins one of David Benatar's primary arguments for antinatalism. In essence, Benatar argues that whereas it is good to have avoided harm by never existing, it is neither good nor bad to be deprived of pleasure by never existing. It is actively good to prevent the potential harms of life, but it is neither good nor bad to deprive a potential person of pleasure, and thus he says it is better not to have children than to have them. In other words, Benatar thinks that pain is bad and pleasure is good. But whereas an absence of pain is good regardless of whether the potentially pained person exists, the absence of pleasure is neither good nor bad for never-existent people. So, whereas the first child in our little thought experiment benefited by never having existed, the second child was not harmed by never having existed. This is sort of a tricky point to get your head round, so do feel free to pause the video and mull it over for a second. Benatar gives a number of examples to illustrate this asymmetry, noticeably around the themes of regret and decision-making. For instance, a very good friend of mine has a pretty unpleasant genetic condition, and he has expressed multiple times that he would not want to have children as he would not want to pass this on to them. Now, regardless of whether or not you think he is justified in his assessment, we can nonetheless understand his reasoning. He wants to prevent the future harm of his child and has decided not to have one as a result. He has even said that if he did end up having a child, he is pretty sure he would regret it. And not because he does not want to look after a child. In fact, he has very strong paternal instincts. But rather, he says he would regret having that child for the child's sake. On the other hand, imagine that someone was the most handsome man in the world, say Henry Cavill, yet he also decided not to have children. Plausibly, if he later came to regret that decision, it is unlikely to be because he regrets depriving a potential child of his astonishing good looks. He might be sad that his genetic blessings will end with him, but if you believe Benatar, it does not make sense to say he regrets it on behalf of the potential child. Indeed, if you thought that it was bad here for the child not to be created, then you might end up arguing that Henry Cavill has a positive duty to have children. And not only that, but as many children as possible. And most people are unwilling to accept a conclusion like this. But then, if we take on board this asymmetry, Benatar points out this has significant conclusions for our own ordinary decisions to reproduce as well. For each of us, our lives will contain some mixture of pleasure and pain. It is not really plausible that there are people for whom life contains absolutely no unpleasantness, even if we would consider that their lives are very, very fortunate. Even someone like Jeff Bezos, who does not share the same troubles most of us have, will still endure some suffering in his life. This was famously pointed out by the Buddha over 2,000 years ago when he remarked that suffering was inevitable, regardless of who we were. When we reproduce, we are simultaneously bringing about two distinct things: the future suffering of our child and their future pleasure. However, if we accept the asymmetry, then preventing the former is a good thing, whereas preventing the latter is neither good nor bad. It is good for the potential child that they would never suffer if they never existed, but it is neither here nor there that the potential child would miss out on all of that pleasure. Again, Benatar's point is that an absence of pain is good even if there is no one around to not feel it, whereas an absence of pleasure is merely not bad if there was no one around to not feel it. As I said, this is a very tricky point to get your head around, and you can outright reject the asymmetry, but Benatar's examples make it scarily plausible. I also want to note here that the asymmetry can be challenged on philosophical grounds, as it has been by David Boonin, but we don't have enough time to get into that. Additionally, if you're an Epicurean, then you might think that the question of non-existence or existence is inherently morally neutral, since there is no way to say that it is a good or bad state for someone to not exist, since they don't exist and they can't bear properties. Again, I don't have time to go into these objections in detail, or else this video would be several hours long. But I do just want to highlight them so that we're aware that this is not a settled debate. In theory, the asymmetry principle is all that Benatar needs for a form of antinatalism. Since it is actively good to prevent the harm of potential people, but it is neither good nor bad to prevent their pleasure, it is more moral to refrain from having children than to have them. And in either case, it is harming the child to bring them into existence. Remarkably, if you fully accept the asymmetry, this would even be the case if the child in question would only suffer a small amount of unpleasantness but an overwhelming amount of pleasure. Since even preventing a negligible amount of harm would be good, whereas preventing a huge amount of pleasure would still be neither good nor bad. However, Benatar realizes that by itself, this is unlikely to convince people not to have children, so this is where his second argument comes into play. He argues that our lives are significantly worse than we tend to think, and are far more characterized by suffering than by pleasure. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing to my Patreon for exclusive content. The link is in the description. 2. The harm of being. Benatar recognizes that there is a very serious objection to any form of antinatalism. People overwhelmingly do not regret coming into existence, and on the whole tend to view their lives in pretty positive terms. This even goes for people who are often perceived of having lives of reasonably poor quality, such as the extremely infirm or the terminally ill. When asked, would you rather have not been born, most people have no trouble in giving a definitive no, and out of those who would answer yes, an even smaller number actually follow through on a wish to unmake themselves. So Benatar's position has an immediate response. If we can be sure that the child we will create would positively evaluate their own life, how can we say that we should not have created them? Well, here Benatar discusses the second pillar of his antinatalist philosophy, that our lives are significantly less pleasant than we think, and that it is only irrational cognitive bias that blinds us to this. First of all, Benatar accuses humanity in general of Pollyannaism, or having a sunnier view on life that is strictly warranted. He cites numerous pieces of empirical psychological research which suggest we overestimate both the positive aspects of our past and overestimate the positive elements of our future when we are asked to reflect upon them. He also points out that we engage in hedonic adaptation, where if our lives, objectively speaking, take a turn for the worse, either from the perspective of our health or our monetary status or our relationships, we initially very much feel the difference and report lower levels of well-being. However, over time this evens out, and we eventually become accustomed to this new circumstance. It is very similar to the observation made by Albert Camus that people can adapt themselves to a great many situations, even pretty awful ones, given enough time. This assessment was also made in the opposite direction by Epicurus, who points out that when our lives improve above a certain base level, that will lose its luster pretty quickly, and we then have to achieve even more to get that thrill back. This is essentially hedonic adaptation in reverse, sometimes called the hedonic treadmill. Secondly, Benatar says that our own assessments of our well-being are much more likely to correlate to how fortunate we perceive ourselves to be as compared with others around us, rather than any sort of absolute judgment on the quality of our lives. Combined with Pollyannaism, he suggests that these comparisons are more likely to show our lives and our character in a more favourable light than is strictly justified. I'll put a few of the studies that he cites in the description in case you want to check them out. Overall, Benatar thinks this bias makes an awful lot of sense. It is probably an evolutionary advantage to be on the optimistic side, and if he is right that we would not feel compelled to reproduce if we truly realized what life was like, then a realistic view of the world, as Benatar sees it, would be automatically bred out of the gene pool. All of this causes him to conclude that we cannot trust our intuitive self-assessment of our own lives. We cannot simply go, well, since most people think their lives are pretty good, then they must be pretty good. Because, for him, this judgment is largely driven by irrational or irrational factors. Funnily enough, Nietzsche was also pretty skeptical of how people assess their own lives, since he thought they were inherently a biased party. But he extended this to judgments about life in general, so would ultimately disagree with David Benatar's conclusions. Having argued for this disconnect between self-assessment and reality, Benatar compares a few different theories of assessing objectively how well one's life is going. And he suggests that, on all of them, most lives really do not come out with shining colours. He starts with hedonistic theories of life assessment, where a life is judged by how much pleasure or pain someone feels. Here, he argues that if we were to pay close attention, most of our lives are marked by some form of discomfort or displeasure. There are biological displeasures, such as hunger, thirst, sexual frustration, or tiredness. Or there are emotional displeasures, like sadness, anger, fear, or ennui. Benatar states that, empirically, we are normally in one or more of these states at any given time. You can test this now. Which of them do you think you're in? These states also come to us very naturally. All we have to do to become hungry is not get up to eat. Benatar then says that our positive states are often characterized by a lack of active negative state, such as the relief we feel when we finally have an empty to-do list. States of extreme excitement or positive pleasure are very rare for Benatar, and he argues that most of the things that we call pleasure are basically some form of relief. His point here is not that life is unbearably hard, but he says there is something odd about deciding to start a life where there are lots of active negative states, but most of the positive ones are simply characterized by a temporary pause in the negative feelings. If that were the deal presented to us when we started life, he suggests we would likely not take it. Once we are here, we may as well make the best of it, especially if death strikes us as particularly painful or terrifying. But Benatar thinks we should not inflict this state on someone else. He presents a similar line of argument for the desire fulfillment models of human well-being. He points out that if we judge a life based on how many of the desires are fulfilled, then we really do not come out well. He argues that a huge number of our wants simply go unanswered, or take an inordinate amount of time and effort to achieve, or are achieved only temporarily. Moreover, as soon as we achieve a desire, our wills have no issue with coming up with another to take its place. You can really detect notes of Schopenhauer here. In fact, philosophies like Buddhism or Stoicism or Schopenhauer's pessimism deal with this by asking us to slowly rein in our desires until they are within a fulfillable bubble. So, on this view too, Benatar is pretty sure that life is, if not a total raw deal, a raw enough deal that we should probably not go about creating new lives willy-nilly. Together, Benatar's asymmetry argument and his argument that life is a lot less pleasant than we think lend credence to the idea that there might be moral issues with having children and with creating lives more generally. The asymmetry argument suggests that if life has any harm, and certainly if it has a significant amount of it, then we should avoid creating new lives. While the second argument aims to show that life has far more harm in it than we normally consider, and that we cannot trust our own judgment that life is, on the whole, positive. As Benatar puts it, coming into existence is always a harm, and it is a serious harm. Right, that is a brief overview of the broad strokes of Benatar's points. I do want to emphasize that he has far more extensive versions of these arguments in his book. But now I want to move on to examining the consequences of the antinatalist position, which Benatar freely admits are both extensive and remarkably counterintuitive. 3. Reproduction, conception, and extinction. So far, we have largely discussed the philosophical foundations for antinatalism. That is, the arguments that suggest that life is not worth starting. But the second half of Benatar's book is slightly wider in scope, and instead examines what is downstream from this proposition. And we shall start with the obvious points about having children. I want to clarify that since now we are discussing the consequences of antinatalism, we will have to assume that it is true for the purposes of this section. But that doesn't mean that you or I are committed to its simpliciter. One immediate consequence of Benatar's arguments is that having a child is bad for the child in question, and to that extent seems immoral. But there is a further issue. To what extent do we allow this immoral action in society? There are some ills, like murder or physical assault, which we make illegal, while there are some others, like adultery, which we do not, even if an affair probably does more harm than slapping someone in the face. So, while Benatar thinks that we should independently choose not to have children, the idea that there should be some top-down intervention to prevent us having children is left somewhat open. On the one hand, we might think that people have the unmitigated right to control their own reproduction, whatever the circumstances. The idea of compelling someone to refrain from having children leaves a pretty nasty taste in the mouth, especially after the eugenics movements of the 20th century. And, as we will explore in more detail later, nasty tastes in the mouth are the stuff ethical objections are built on. Benatar clarifies that he does not think people have the moral right to have children, since he cannot simultaneously say that we have a duty not to have children and a right to have them. However, he does say that reproduction may fall into the same sort of category as something like adultery, a harm that we nonetheless do not make illegal because of the dangers or consequences of enforcing a law against it. Think about what the consequences of an actively antinatalist policy might entail. Things like forced medical procedures or infidelity arguably may cause more harm than allowing further people to be brought into existence. Benatar also concedes we may say someone has the absolute right to control their own reproduction, regardless of the consequences. Of course, none of this affects Benatar's overall idea that at the individual level we have a duty not to have children. He just thinks it is not a duty that should definitely be enforced by the state. For instance, we also plausibly have a duty to not promote false statements, but the idea of the state making lying or just untruths illegal seems a pretty significant overstep. The only exception Benatar raises to this would be if the population could be made infertile painlessly, like through some chemical distributed in the air. But on the whole, he's pretty ambivalent about this proposal as well. And privately, I'm quite thankful that most people are. Benatar is also pretty clear that antinatalism does not imply a pro-death position. Just because a life is not worth starting does not mean it is not worth continuing. And I basically concur with this point. Plausibly, the whole reason antinatalism arises as a distinct moral question is because the relevant party, the unborn child, is not present. Once someone is alive, you can ask them if they want to continue living. Sure, they may overestimate the quality of their lives, as Benatar himself argued in the last section, but we can delegate the responsibility of life or death decisions to them. They are a full agent who can make their own choices. It may have been better for them to have never been born, but they're here now, so they can decide where to go. It's a bit like getting lost on a hike. It would have been better to have never set off, but now that you're there, you can make a series of choices, one of which is death. Benatar also says that once you exist, you might plausibly have an interest in continuing to exist, such as wanting to bring about certain states in the world, experience more pleasure, or have your desires fulfilled. But perhaps Benatar's most controversial conclusion from antinatalism is that he is pro-extinction. Since he thinks that, all things considered, it would be better for each future person to have never been born, he ultimately concludes that it would also be better for the human race as a whole to stop existing. Now, it's important to clarify exactly what Benatar means by this. He is not suggesting that extinction should be achieved by killing everyone on Earth. And he also points out that if everyone stopped having children at this very moment, then the last 100 years or so of humanity would be very difficult indeed. We would probably all die horribly when there were no longer enough people who could work farms or keep reservoirs running. Instead, Benatar's ideal scenario is a sort of phased extinction, whereby we gradually tail off the number of people until the human race ceases to be with the least amount of suffering possible. Though Benatar admits this seems sad, it's also a small price to pay for preventing the suffering of all the generations that would succeed us. And remember, since preventing suffering is good even in the absence of the person who would have suffered, this is a huge moral victory, as well as a huge personal victory for every potential person who will now no longer be born. I kind of appreciate Benatar sticking by his principles here. A lot of thinkers would have shied away from this, or deemed it a repugnant conclusion, but he follows through. And it is undeniable. If you're an antinatalist on the grounds that it is better to have never been born, then barring some very special consideration, it would be much better if the whole human race slowly dies off, since then, no more people can be born. Of course, different antinatalists will have different conclusions for each of these points. Someone who bases their position primarily on the idea that life is truly awful may take a pretty pro-death position. But if so, this would be technically separable from their antinatalism. These are all pretty tough pills to swallow, so the question inevitably arises, what about the unintuitiveness of antinatalism? Is that not a point against it? Well, Benatar himself does not think so, but the particular way in which he argues this point is fascinating, and I think we can use it to learn about topics far beyond the particular morality of having children. Which is why, for our final point, I would like to hone in on ethical intuition. 4. Intuition and rationality. There are very few things more intuitive than the idea that having children is not a bad thing. As Benatar himself points out, if we did not have this intuition, then we would have died out a long time ago, though perhaps he regrets this ultimately did not happen. Benatar then has to argue that this intuition is either in some way irrelevant or outweighed by other factors. He does most of this in the final chapter of his book, which is perhaps the most philosophically interesting one as well. Benatar criticizes the intuition that having children is not bad, as either irrational or irrational, just like our judgment that life was good. He says that our intuitions here seem thoroughly untrustworthy. And I'm actually going to read directly from the book here, because I think the way he puts this point is very interesting. How reliable can an intuition be if it allows the infliction of great harm that could have been avoided without any cost to the person who is harmed? Such an intuition would not be worthy of respect in any other context. This essentially pits the pronatalist intuition against the points Benatar has made in his book. If his arguments are right, then the intuition that reproduction is good or neutral causes a lot of damage, and so should not be respected. But, of course, like pretty much any ethical argument, Benatar's own position begins with an intuition, the one that supports the asymmetry principle, or the axiological asymmetry principle, as he has come to call it more recently. And what I find fascinating about this paragraph is that you can basically run the objection the other way as well. Imagine that anti-Benatar from Opposite World is writing a book called Great to Have Been, Why You Should Be At It Like Rabbits. We might imagine him criticizing the asymmetry principle a bit like this. How reliable can an intuition be if it allows the extinction of the human race and could justify governments forcibly sterilizing their populace? Such an intuition would not be worthy of respect in any other context. These are both attempts at a reductio ad absurdum argument. They aim to show the absurdity of a set of premises by pointing to a conclusion that is obviously false. But it's not clear to me that the second paragraph is any less convincing than the first one. This seems to be a genuine clash of intuitions. So, which do we pick from? Well, Benatar is obviously aware of this problem, and in later years he has alluded that he thinks antinatalism is the wiser choice. By wisdom here, he seems to be referring to some process whereby we set competing ethical intuitions against one another and see which is better supported. But there is a real question about what better supported would mean in this context. Especially if you're not a straightforward moral realist, how do we judge which of the ethical intuitions is wiser than the other? And even if you are a die-hard moral realist and you think there is a determinate right answer to every ethical question, there is still the epistemological issue of how to find it. This is not just a problem for the antinatalist, but the extent of the clash between the antinatalist and the pronatalist intuitions are unusually extreme. So it brings this meta-ethical problem out into the open in a rather nice way. Benatar also argues that we have excellent reason for thinking that pronatal intuitions are the product of, at least non-rational, but possibly irrational, psychological forces. And I find this point interesting in a very similar way. It implies that there is a division between rational ethical intuitions and non-rational ones, i.e., that our ethical intuitions are subject to some higher force called rationality. But this division seems to require some pretty significant epistemological grounding. For instance, what makes my intuition that pain is bad rational? The trouble is, we normally call things irrational when there is some violation of the laws of logic in the reasoning applied, or if it flies in the face of some pre-established standard. Thus, it is irrational to affirm the consequent, and it is also irrational to sacrifice your queen for no gain during a chess game. But the intuition that having children is morally neutral or morally good does not contradict a law of logic. And because this debate strikes at the heart of what it means for an action to be ethical, it doesn't seem like there is a higher standard to appeal to. This is setting the standard. You can almost feel Benatar's frustration at not having a knockdown argument against the unintuitiveness objection, and I totally get where he's coming from. In effect, the trouble is that in ethics, our moral intuitions are both the very things we are putting to the test and the standard by which we're testing them. In Benatar's case, the intuition that having children is good or neutral is being put to the test against the intuitions behind the asymmetry principle. The pronatalist is instead putting the asymmetry principle to the test against the intuition that having children is morally neutral or good, or at the very least that coming into existence is not bad. Arguably, this is part of the inherent epistemic uncertainty that comes with edge cases in ethics. There's a pretty wide literature on this very problem in metaethics. I'm not suggesting that there are no solutions, but rather that antinatalism is a good example of where this becomes especially prominent. But this, in turn, leads to a pretty interesting potential objection to antinatalism. At one point in his book, Benatar says that one of the only responses to antinatalism he has much time for is an epistemic point about uncertainty. Here, someone would argue that the antinatalist may be wrong, and there is enough doubt in their conclusions that we should not make broad decisions like phasing out the human race on their basis. Benatar's response to this is totally understandable. He says that unless they can point to a specific thing wrong with the arguments put forward by the antinatalist, then they're sort of gesturing at a critique rather than making one. However, the epistemological challenges we just looked at reopen this position. Benatar's argument is no longer as clear or inferentially neat as it was before. Now he has the addition of this wisdom component, for instance. We also confront the clash between the two ethical intuitions, and a reason to suspect that one decisively winning out over the other may be very doubtful. Suddenly, the epistemic objection appears to have gained quite a lot of ground. If it is either genuinely indeterminate which one of these intuitions is more justified or rational than the other, or if there are significant difficulties in us finding out which one is the determinate victor, then there is room to argue that, considering the vast implications of antinatalism, we cannot be certain enough in its arguments to assent to it. At least, not yet. I'm not particularly married to this argument either way, but I do find it especially interesting, as it crosses over with ethics, epistemology, metaethics, and even decision theory, arguably. Of course, there are many objections raised to each point Benatar makes in this book. There's arguably not a single uncontroversial step in the whole thing, but I highly recommend that you read it for yourself. Whether you find the arguments convincing or not, it can provide a real insight into what ethical argumentation looks like when the stakes are high and the chips are down. It will challenge some of your deepest preconceived intuitions and force you to question how we know whether something is right or wrong. But if this video has whetted your appetite for tricky ethical dilemmas, then click here to watch my take on what I consider to be one of the most difficult moral problems of all time. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life. That is, if you don't regret that it even started.